In our last lecture, we examined the trial of Socrates as a test case of the Athenian democracy and its ideals of freedom. That test case was essentially between the ideal of individual freedom and the freedom of the community as a whole. That is why I suggested that the Athenians were correct to put Socrates to death, because he stood for a concept of freedom in which the individual himself was the arbiter. God, speaking through Socrates, determined his actions and not the will of the majority as a whole. It was a feature of the Athenian democracy to foster individual liberty. Yet Socrates carried it to a degree that made it dangerous to the community as a whole. But in fact, this ideal of the individual would become the hallmark of the 4th century and introduce the next great age in the history of freedom. To that theme we want to turn now with a focus upon Alexander the Great as one of those individuals who transforms history, proving that history is made not by anonymous social and economic events, but by great individuals. The 4th century, after the death of Socrates, did not see the end of the Athenian democracy. In fact, our best discussion of the Athenian democracy comes from Aristotle, working in Athens in the 4th century. It was still in full vitality, pay for office, lot, committees, all the features of the Athenian democracy of the 5th century. But underneath, there was a new set of currents. We mark it first and most perceptibly in the comedies of Aristophanes. During the 5th century, down to the time of the end of the Peloponnesian War, the comedies of Aristophanes focused upon political events. They were satires dealing in the most serious, comical fashion with issues of profound importance, poking fun at Pericles, poking fun at leaders of the popular party like Cleon, poking fun at Alcibiades, and even Socrates himself. But after the Peloponnesian War, there's a change in Aristophanes. Attempting to please his audience, the theme is with the individual. Topics like wealth, how to make money, that is what people are concerned with. We see it in the change of the Athenians towards military service. During the 5th century, it was the most important civic duty to serve in the army. In the 4th century, this simply is no longer true. Athenians have a mercenary army, a professional army, and only on very rare occasions and under the greatest crisis do the Athenians themselves serve in the army. We see it also in the philosophical currents. Plato, the pupil of Socrates, certainly was embittered by the trial and death of his teacher. But more than that, he came to understand that the Athenian democracy was ultimately a failure. And he turned instead to the idea of monarchy. And he believed that the best form of government was ruled by a single superior individual, an individual who could achieve such heights that his fellow citizens would regard him as a god. And from one such ruler, liberty and good things could flow. But even liberty had to be carefully controlled. And the ideal state of Plato and the Republic was much more like Sparta than it was Athens. So the finest minds were giving up the hope of democracy. And so to an Aristotle, democracy was viewed as a failed form of government, even a perverted form of government, a degenerate form of government. And Aristotle himself believed that the best of all worlds would be that of a good king. Now this would turn into reality under Philip of Macedonia. Macedonia, on the fringe of the Greek world, underwent a tremendous transformation by Philip. Its army became the best in the Greek world, and Philip proved himself during his rule from 356 to 338 BC to be the most far-sighted statesman Greece had ever produced. By a mixture of diplomacy and warfare, he raised Macedonia to the first position among Greek states, and then, on the field of Chaeronea, in the year 338 BC, defeated the army of Athens and its allies from Thebes and Corinth. Still today, we can drive by the stone lion that rests over the bones of the Thebans who died in the Battle of Chaeronea. And this lion of Chaeronea marks the end of the city-state as the dominant force in Greek political life. From this time onward, Greece would be dominated by kings, by monarchs. In their own terms, these were men who stood above the law, men of enormous capability, like Philip. Philip planned an expedition against Persia. It was his idea to unite the Greeks by this expedition to liberate the cities of Asia Minor, and thus to establish his absolute hegemony as leader of the Greek world. But he was assassinated in 336 BC, followed by his son Alexander, then only 20 years of age. The Greek world thought that this would be a passing moment in history, that the young king, like so many kings of Macedonia before him, like his father, would be assassinated. Instead, he would transform history. The story of Alexander, as we read it in Plutarch, as we read it in the pages of Arrian, drawing upon first-hand sources, Ptolemy and Aristobulus, the story of Alexander is one of the great romances of history. It begins with his youth. His father one day received from a friend a horse called Bucephalus, from the little spot on his forehead like an ox, and no one could ride the horse. Stable boys tried it, nobody could master it. And so Philip was there with the friend who had given him the horse, young Alexander, and the boy said, "Let me ride it, Father." The father said, "No, you're too young." Alexander said, "I promise you that if I can't ride it, I will buy the horse." And Philip said, "But that would take your allowance for years to come." And Alexander said, "Let me ride it." And Philip finally said, go ahead, break your neck." And the boy took the horse and patted it, and then leapt upon it and rode it off around and around and around. When he came back, his father said, "Son, find another kingdom, for Macedonia will never be great enough for you." In that story, the image was portrayed of Alexander as more than human. Animals recognize divinity before men do. And that laid the foundation for the view that men would hold quite sincerely, those who knew Alexander best, that somehow he was divine. When his father was assassinated, Alexander, who had been educated by Aristotle, trained by his father as a soldier and a statesman, took up the expedition of Philip. But from the outset, his vision was very, very different. He dreamt of conquering the entire Persian Empire. And with a force of less than 40,000 men, in the spring of 334, he crossed the Hellespont, not far from where Xerxes had crossed so many years before, offering up sacrifice at the tomb of Achilles, linking himself with Homer in that great tradition. He always carried under his pillar a copy of Homer, commentated upon by Aristotle himself. In a sweeping campaign of 1 year, he liberated the Greek cities of Asia Minor, but didn't go home. He established democracies in those cities and then pushed on to the shores of Phoenicia. The army of Persia under King Darius was conquered in the Battle of Issus in November of 333, and Darius himself led the field of battle. The great city of Tyre was captured in a 9-month siege. Alexander had already, during his time in Asia Minor, gone to the oracle at the city of Gordion, and there it had been foretold that he would conquer all of Asia. While he was in Egypt, he went to the oracle of Ammon out in the desert at Siwa, and learned again not only that he would reach the ends of the world, that he would never be conquered, but this time was told that he was the Son of God. And the priest at the oracle of Ammon explained to him the millennia-old traditions of Egyptian kingship. Alexander himself, instead of treating the shrines of Egypt with contempt, as the Persians had done, rebuilt them. He allowed himself to be crowned as Pharaoh and learned that he had been sired by God, by Ammon. And then continued his campaign deep into Persia. A final defeat of the Persian king at Gaugamela, the capture of the city of Persepolis, and then, astounding to his soldiers, he was crowned as king of Persia. Instead of dividing up the Persian Empire among his Macedonians as spoils, he appointed Persians as governors of the key provinces. He adopted Persian court ceremonies. Men now bowed before Alexander, kissed his toe. And then, having conquered the lands of Bactria and Sogdiana, what we would call Afghanistan and Turkestan, he married the daughter of a Bactrian chieftain, the chieftain Oxyartes, the beautiful Roxanne, his daughter, and made the promise that the son she would bear him would be heir to his empire. And then, with an army no longer consisting just of Macedonians and Greeks, he would march across the Hindu Kush, cross the Indus River, and there on the banks of the river Hydaspes defeat the great Indian Maharaja, Porus. The battle itself portrays Alexander as the greatest soldier in history, which is what he was. A master of tactics and strategy, of logistics and a battlefield commander, ferrying his troops across the river in a bold flank attack. So charismatic, so dynamic in generating the loyalty of his soldiers that his Macedonians would charge the great war elephants of Porus, shouting as they attacked, "To Zeus the king and for Alexander." And then, having defeated Porus, he would reach out the hand of friendship to the king. When Porus was taken captive, surrendering to Alexander voluntarily, Alexander asked him, "What can I do for you?" And Porus said, "Treat me like a king." And Alexander said, "That goes without saying. Is there anything else?" Porus said, "No, whatever I want would be covered by that request." So Alexander said, "Then do something for me. Be my friend," and stretched out his hand. And there, along the banks of the river Hydaspes, east met west. And Porus would be confirmed in his kingdom enlarged, and he would serve Alexander as a faithful friend for as long as Alexander lived. On the banks of the river, Alexander would build two cities, one to the city of Victory and one to Bucephalus, the great horse, the horse of his youth that he had ridden all these great miles. And then, marching further, his troops finally breaking, begging to go home to Macedonia. And so Alexander would take them home, but first sail them down the Indus River, down to the great ocean that the Greeks believe encircled the world, and there offer up sacrifices to the gods he'd been told to worship by the shrine at Ammon, meaning that he had found the far ends of the world. And then back to Babylon, and there began to create new plans for a conquest of the Western Mediterranean, a conquest of Carthage, but at the same time giving concrete realization to his growing understanding that Aristotle had been wrong. His teacher was simply wrong. Aristotle had taught him that Greeks are superior. Barbarians are inherently slaves, and freedom alone is for Greeks. This, after all, was the view of the Athenians. The Athenian view of liberty was narrow. It was highly exclusive. By a law of 454, only someone whose grandparents were Athenian could be an Athenian citizen. For Alexander, this idea was proven false. And it was proven false on the field of battle, where he'd seen the courage of Persians. He had seen the courage of Bactrians and Sogdianians. He had learned that men like Porus were every bit as good as any Greek or Macedonian. And so he grew in his realization that there was a unity of mankind. And at a great banquet held near Babylon in the city of Opus, he brought his Macedonians, his Greeks, his Persians all together and offered up a cup of harmony and concord, that they would rule together. Moreover, he married and encouraged his highest officers to marry Persian women. And he had his soldiers marry the women of Bactria and Sogdiana, of Persia, those that they might have been living with, but now they married. It wasn't a very well-accepted decision. His soldiers couldn't understand this broader notion. But step by step, he led them to see that all men were created equal. As he continued his plans, he proposed a transmigration of people from Asia to Europe and from Europe to Asia, believing, and we're told this quite literally, that only by intermarriage could men finally accept one another as brothers. And when he died, still not 33 years of age, one of the last acts was to strike a coin, showing himself as the divinely sent mediator. And on his coins he is portrayed gazing up into heaven, just as Plato had described the good king gazing into heaven, his vision fixed upon God. Now, recent generations of historians have wanted to debunk this idea of Alexander and the unity of mankind, but it is there in our sources. It is clear that the ancients believed Alexander saw this bolder vision, this broader vision. Historians perhaps themselves, as when they debunk the founders of this country, are incapable of understanding this true greatness, this vision. But we know the reality of what Alexander dreamt. The years after Alexander the Great, the new age that comes into being as a result of his conquest, is called the Age of Hellenism, the Hellenistic Age. It is one in which the culture of Greece is played out over a far broader arena. Greek culture will go as far as India and all the way out to the Pillars of Hercules. Greek will become a common language, and Greek culture a unifying force among the kingdoms established by Alexander's successors, like Ptolemy in Egypt, Seleucus in the Persian Empire, and among the Romans themselves. The sources, above all Plutarch, describe the creation of Alexander of cities far out in Bactria, in Afghanistan, cities where the plays of Euripides were performed and where Greek temples were built alongside foreign cults. Again, historians debunk them until the spade of the archaeologist in far-off Afghanistan, in Ai-Khanoun, the Lake of the Moon, as the site is called, discovered one of these Alexandrias, one of these cities founded by Alexander, settled with his veterans and their Bactrian wives, where their children grew up, not Greek, not Bactrian, but simply citizens of Alexander's world. And there we find a Greek temple, side by side with a Buddha shrine, and the teachings of the Buddha inscribed side by side with Greek philosophical maxims. So no dream, but a reality. And the impact of Alexander would be felt far away. In India, the conquest of Alexander in what is now Pakistan and moving slightly into India were of such a force that they would serve as a catalyst for the first unification of the Indian subcontinent. And within 3 generations, the Indian king, ruler over all of India, Ashoka, would spread the teachings of Buddha throughout the Far East. It is no exaggeration to say that without the conquest of Alexander, Buddhism would never have spread. But the impact of Alexander had far more direct implications. In the Greek world, it issued in an age of monarchy and an age of individual freedom. For the corollary of all men being created equal was that all men equally should have freedom. And Alexander understood this, that under a single great ruler like Alexander, all could be truly equal and all could be truly free. That is the vision that Plutarch, the great biographer, attributes to Alexander the Great. That it had a reality is shown by the philosophical currents that emerge after Alexander's death. Most importantly, the philosophy of Stoicism. In this new age of Hellenism, Stoicism would be the most significant intellectual force. A force that would begin, not long after Alexander's death, percolate through the Roman world, so that a Roman emperor, Marcus Aurelius, would write for us one of the most profound statements of Stoic thought. And in Tarsus, a Jewish rabbinical student named Saul would learn the philosophy of the Stoa and preach the gospel of Jesus in Stoic philosophical terms on the Hill of Mars in Athens. At the root of Stoicism was the concept of the free individual. That internal freedom is all that matters. Alexander had already experienced this even before his expedition. He had gone to Corinth to take command of the Greek Confederation. While he was there, he and his officers visited Diogenes, a forerunner of this Stoic thought. Diogenes, who went around with a lantern looking for an honest man. Diogenes the cynic. And Diogenes was living in a bathtub in the nude. And Alexander approached him and said, "Is there anything I can do for you?" And Diogenes said, "Yes, but you step aside, you're standing in the sun, you're kind of ruining the tan I'm working on here." And Alexander's officers turned to him and said, "How can you allow him to speak to you with such contempt?" And Alexander said, "Listen, if I could not be Alexander, I would want to be Diogenes. If I could not be the absolute man of action, then I would want to be the absolute man of thought, because he owes nothing to anyone." And so it would be that in India, Alexander would question the nude wise men, the men you still see, the holy men of India that you still see roaming the subcontinent, dressed in nothing but a loincloth. And he would question them and ask them and show the greatest interest and sympathy for their studies. And one of them would follow Alexander. And when his comrade said, "How can you go off with that Yavan, that Greek?" he said, "Because I have already found my God." So Alexander, as the man of action, the man sent by God, inspiring a concept of individual freedom. Zeno, the founder of the Stoic way of thought, was from Phoenicia. And Stoicism had a profound cosmopolitan element. You were not believed to be an Athenian or Macedonian. You were truly a citizen of the world. It had a profound religious element. The hymns to Zeus of the Stoics could take their place right alongside any Christian hymn for their evocation of the all-seeing, all-powerful God who believes only in justice, the creator of the world. And the Stoic believed that all things happen in accord with the plan of God, and that true freedom rests in making yourself accommodate the plan of God. The great misery is in arguing with what God has given you. And so, in the thought of Stoics like Zeno, like Epictetus in the 1st century AD, we find the idea that the only thing over which you have control is your mind, the thoughts you make with that mind, and the actions you take based on those thoughts. And there you are totally free. no one can control you. Epictetus, like many of the Stoic thinkers, had been born a slave, his body brutalized by a cruel master. But he had grown, gained his freedom, was a powerful teacher in Rome, and then was sent into exile. That didn't break him. God, for some reason, had exiled him to Nicopolis, in windy, cold Epirus, and there he would teach. You can never be broken as long as you remain master of your own mind. It's a powerful, liberating thought, fully suited to an age of the individual and of political apathy, because that was the other side of Stoicism. Why care what form of government you had? They were all equally good or equally bad. They had no effect upon what was critical, your soul. And the Stoics looked upon their founder as Socrates. For it had been Socrates who taught that it is the soul that is immortal, and that our primary concern must be with the soul. That in finding liberation for the soul, we find true freedom. Now, this ideal would become part of Roman society. And the Romans themselves were the true heirs of Alexander the Great. Roman emperors like Trajan would see themselves as new Alexanders. They would see themselves like Alexander, creating a world in which freedom and citizenship was universal. By 212 AD, in fact, every citizen of the Roman Empire became a citizen. Every freeborn inhabitant of the Roman Empire became a citizen. A decree passed by the Emperor Caracalla, who of all the Roman emperors most compared himself to Alexander. But it was more than a world state. It was a world state based upon the Stoic and Alexander principles of equality. And into Roman law would be written the idea that all men are created equal and endowed by God with the natural right of freedom. Now, men may have reduced them to slavery, but it was the ideal of God that they all be free. That concept is born with Alexander and his attempt to place this into reality in the world empire that he was creating. So Alexander is one of the great fertilizing forces in history. But it was not only in the empire of Rome, it was in the religious currents of that age as well. It is not an exaggeration to say, from a historical perspective, that without the Roman Empire, Christianity could never have spread. It was the peace of the Roman Empire that allowed it to spread, but it was also the cultural unity. And that cultural unity was created by Alexander and the spread of Greek culture all over the Mediterranean world. Thus, it would be no accident that Paul would write his letters in Greek, that the Greek language would carry him all over the Mediterranean world, or that the Gospels were written in Greek. And the Gospels themselves were understood by a people united in culture, and one that had already a foretaste of this in the conception of Alexander, the Son of God, by a mortal woman, sent to earth to bring peace and, in the very terms used to describe Alexander, salvation, a divinely sent Savior who out of his conquest brought a new order. But that order would only come into being with much blood. Not only the blood shed by Alexander, but the blood shed in the course of the rise of Rome to world empire. And the rise of Rome, the concept of republican liberty, the way in which the Romans at the height of their power and affluence would trade freedom for the security of dictatorship, and out of that build a new era of peace and prosperity, one in which this conception of individual liberty could flourish. That'll be our theme in our next 3 lectures.